Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Wichita. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1889, and Wichita, Kansas was caught in an uneasy transition. Once a booming cattle town filled with dust, saloons, and promise, it was now slowly reshaping itself into a city of railroads and industry. Yet, beneath that new veneer of progress, the same old darkness lingered, one that didn't make it into the official ledgers. The story begins at a small establishment known locally as Ward's Temperance Saloon, an ironic name for a place that sold whiskey by the bucket. The owner, a man named Silas Ward, had arrived from St. Louis the year before. He was clean-shaven, always dressed in dark wool, and wore a top hat even indoors. Locals described him as a man who spoke softly and stirred his drink too long. At first, Ward's saloon seemed ordinary: dim lamps, sawdust floors, and a piano that hadn't been tuned since Grant was in office. But townsfolk soon whispered that Ward's whiskey burned differently. Some swore it had a metallic tang. Others said it left an oily residue on the lips. When a farmer named Elias Boone collapsed one night after 3 shots, it was chalked up to overindulgence. But by week's end, 2 more patrons were found dead in their beds, each with a faint black mark at the corner of the mouth. The Wichita constable, James Tolliver, opened a brief inquiry but found nothing unusual. In his words, the men were drinkers, and the whiskey was clean enough to the nose. Yet the undertaker, Samuel Laird, recorded something different. In his private notes, found decades later in a box of church donations, he wrote, "The tissue under the tongue was coarse and gray, not like any I have seen in men dead of liquor." Meanwhile, newspapers of the time, such as the Wichita Eagle, printed almost nothing of the deaths. The city was trying to distance itself from the rough cowboy image that once defined it. As noted in the history of Wichita, Kansas, civic leaders were eager to promote the town as modern and respectable. A scandal about poisoned whiskey would have undone months of carefully crafted reputation. But locals still talked. At the barber shop, in the churchyard, and at the rail depot, men whispered of corpse whiskey and the strange man who ran the saloon that served it. Ward smiled through it all, serving each drink with meticulous care, always from the same unmarked bottle behind the counter. And one cold evening in December, a drifter from Dodge named Henry Pike would taste from that same bottle and start a chain of events that would unearth one of the most macabre discoveries ever recorded in Sedgwick County history. Henry Pike was a man without a fixed place or purpose, a railway hand, gambler, and occasional hired guard. He arrived in Wichita on December 7, 1889, looking for work and warmth. The night was bitterly cold, and the wind carried the scent of coal smoke from the rail yard. According to the depot clerk's register, Pike asked for directions to the quietest saloon that don't ask questions. He was pointed toward Ward's. Witness accounts, preserved later in an affidavit by Constable Tolliver, described Pike entering the saloon just before midnight. He was seen speaking with Ward briefly before taking a stool near the far end of the bar. There were only 2 other men present, a blacksmith named Daniel Sutter and an out-of-town peddler whose name was never recorded. Pike ordered a single glass of whiskey. Ward poured it slowly, his movements careful and silent. Those who saw it remembered how the lamplight caught the liquid, not golden like usual whiskey, but dull, with a reddish tint that clung to the sides of the glass. Pike drank it in one swallow and remarked, half joking, "That tastes like it came out of a coffin." Ward, according to Sutter's later statement, only smiled and said, "You might not be far wrong." An hour later, Pike stumbled out into the snow. He was found the next morning in the alley behind the saloon, face down, his hat frozen to the ground. At first glance, it seemed he'd simply fallen drunk and died of exposure. But when the undertaker examined him, he noticed something unsettling. Pike's tongue and lower gums had turned dark gray, and his fingernails bore a thin, oily residue that smelled faintly of metal. Rumors began to spread again, and this time, even respectable men joined the talk. The newspaper didn't print the story, but letters in the county archives show that several townspeople, including a minister named Reverend Jonah Bell, wrote to the city council demanding the saloon be inspected. The council declined, calling it speculation unfit for civic record. By midwinter, 5 unexplained deaths were quietly entered in Sedgwick County's burial log, all traced back to men who drank at Ward's saloon. Constable Tolliver returned to investigate again in January. Ward allowed him behind the bar, showing his stock openly, barrels from known distilleries, labels intact, nothing suspicious. But Tolliver noted in his report that one small barrel lacked any brand mark and was sealed with black wax. Ward claimed it was a private blend from St. Louis, and Tolliver, under pressure from the mayor's office, accepted the answer. Years later, when historians examined these records while compiling the history of Wichita, Kansas, they found inconsistencies in Tolliver's account, lines crossed out, pages missing, and a single marginal note in a different hand that read, "By February of 1890, Ward's saloon had become a place people mentioned only in whispers. Those who still went there did so quietly, often at night, and never stayed long. The piano remained silent, the lamps burned low, and the faint metallic odor, noticed by many but discussed by few, hung permanently in the air." Among the few surviving accounts from that winter is a letter written by Thomas Greer, a bookkeeper who boarded in the same building. His letter to his sister, dated February 11th, describes a low scraping noise that came from beneath the saloon floor at irregular hours, as if a shovel moved earth very slowly. Greer believed Ward kept a private store cellar, but he also mentioned that the saloon's foundation was built on older property, one that had once served as a temporary mortuary during a cholera outbreak in the 1860s. That grim detail appears again in county maps from the period, now housed in the Sedgwick County Historical Society. A faded annotation reads simply, "Old Yard, disused 1871. The yard lay directly beneath Ward's property line. In late February, an itinerant telegraph repairman named Caleb Dunn stayed one night in the saloon's back room, trading labor for shelter. Dunn later gave a statement, found in his papers decades later, that described Ward as quiet, well-spoken, but with the look of a man who listens too closely. He also claimed that, during the night, he awoke to the smell of lye and smoke, and saw Ward standing near a trapdoor in the corner, lowering something wrapped in cloth. When asked about it the next morning, Ward reportedly replied, "Waste from the barrels. I dispose of it myself." Dunn left Wichita the following week and never returned. Meanwhile, entries from the county's death register continue to show heart failure and exposure as the causes of death for men last seen at Ward's. Reverend Bell again pressed the council for an inquiry. His notes, preserved by the First Methodist Archives, describe a meeting with the mayor in which Bell was told, "Mr. Ward has friends in St. Louis. The matter is closed." Around this time, a small, weather-stained ledger surfaced in a pawn shop on Douglas Avenue. It contained lists of names, dates, and short remarks such as 2 shots, no reaction, and stronger mix worked. Though the handwriting was faint, a comparison by a later archivist suggested it matched Ward's known signature from business documents. The ledger vanished soon after it was sold to an unknown buyer, but a surviving page was copied by the shop owner before its disappearance. At the bottom of that page was a single line, half smudged but still legible. "Oil of the dead yields smoother flame." Historians who later examined this phrase drew parallels to known 19th century practices involving tallow and embalming fluids. In the history of Wichita, Kansas, it's mentioned that certain frontier morticians experimented with alcohol preservation techniques for bodies transported long distances. The similarity, though circumstantial, added a disturbing credibility to what was once dismissed as folklore. By early spring, even the bravest locals began avoiding Ward's entirely. But one man, a traveling journalist from Topeka, arrived that March determined to learn the truth behind the so-called corpse whiskey. The journalist's name was Edward Latham, a correspondent for the Topeka Daily Review. He had built a modest reputation writing about frontier crimes and strange deaths along the Santa Fe line. In early March 1890, he arrived in Wichita after hearing rumors of poison whiskey, and missing men. His first stop was the city clerk's office, where he found nothing unusual in the licensing records. Ward's saloon appeared perfectly legitimate, its taxes paid in full, and its shipments logged without irregularity. But Latham's curiosity was not so easily quieted. He began speaking to townsfolk, the barber, a laundress, the undertaker, and finally Constable Tolliver himself. Most were reluctant to talk, fearing what they called that man's reach. Tolliver, though cordial, warned him that Ward had friends in the business circles and suggested he write about rail progress instead. Nevertheless, Latham persisted. His private notebook, discovered years later in a trunk donated to the Wichita Historical Society, recorded his impressions in detail. One passage reads, "There is something unwholesome in the man's eyes. His saloon smells not only of whiskey, but of wet soil and lime. The patrons speak low, and I saw one man leave without drinking after glancing behind the bar." On March 12th, Latham visited the saloon at dusk, posing as a traveler. He ordered a drink and began to ask about the town. Ward was polite, but his answers were clipped, formal. He wore his dark top hat even behind the bar, his pale hands moving slowly as he poured. Latham later wrote that he noticed a trapdoor set flush with the wooden floor, half hidden by a rug. When he asked about it, Ward smiled faintly and said, "That's where the old ghosts live." The next morning, Latham arranged a discreet meeting with Undertaker Samuel Laird, hoping for confirmation about the unusual conditions of the dead men. Itted, weary and cautious, admitted off the record that he had seen a strange graying of the tissues and a heavy odor of oil or chemical tincture. He also claimed that Ward purchased large quantities of distilled spirits and carbolic acid under false names. That evening, Latham returned to the saloon intending to confront him. But when he arrived, Ward was gone. The lamps were burning low, and the place was empty except for a faint warmth in the air, as if someone had just left. In his notes, Latham described finding damp soil near the trapdoor and a metallic taste that clung to the throat. The next day, he sought a warrant for entry, but the city attorney refused. By the end of that week, Latham's dispatches stopped arriving in Topeka. His editor assumed he had moved on to another story. Weeks later, a farmer discovered a blood-stained notebook lying in the ditch off Seneca Street. Inside were notes written in Latham's hand, the last entry dated March 15th. "He keeps something below the floor, something that breathes slower than a man." The book was turned over to authorities but never returned to the paper. In later editions of the History of Wichita, Kansas, a brief footnote mentions the unexplained disappearance of a traveling reporter during the winter of 1889-90. It does not name Latham directly, but the timeline and location match exactly. The thaw came late that year. March slipped into April, and the Arkansas River swelled against its banks. With the melting snow came a smell that many in the lower district couldn't quite place, something sharp, sour, and faintly chemical drifting through the alleys near Ward's saloon. On April 9, 1890, a wagon driver named Frank Dorr reported that his horse refused to pass the saloon. It balked, kicking and rearing, even when whipped. Dorr mentioned it to a passing patrolman, and the next morning Constable Tolliver returned for a third inspection. Ward met him at the door, polite as ever, his gloves spotless. He offered the constable a drink, which Tolliver declined. According to his later deposition, Tolliver asked about the odor. Ward replied that he'd been cleaning his cellar with old spirits and quicklime to keep the dampness down. When Tolliver requested to see it, Ward hesitated before saying softly, "There are things down there that won't take kindly to daylight." Tolliver, uneasy, returned 2 days later with a warrant signed by the deputy marshal. Ward was gone. The saloon stood unlocked. Inside, the air was dense, heavy with the stench of burnt alcohol and decay. Behind the bar, the small rug had been pushed aside, revealing the iron ring of the trapdoor. 2 officers and the undertaker descended by lantern light. The floor beneath was earthen, slick with moisture. The first thing they saw was a line of wooden crates stacked against the wall, each stamped with faint shipping marks from St. Louis. Inside, instead of whiskey bottles, were glass jars filled with a pale, oily liquid, and something else suspended within it, small strips of grayish flesh. The official record, preserved in Sedgwick County's archives, lists their discovery simply as organic remnants unidentified. But Laird's personal notes, found decades later, were more direct. Ski, and fat rendered into spirit, sealed for storage. The odor was like that of sweet decay. Beneath the crates lay a wooden vat fitted with a copper spigot, the source, perhaps, of the special blend Ward had so proudly served. The soil around it was stained dark and oily, and nearby they found bones, small and brittle, too fragmented to name. Tolliver ordered the area sealed and sent word to the coroner in Hutchinson. By the time the wagon arrived the next day, the saloon had burned to the ground. Witnesses saw the blaze just after midnight, a clean, bright fire that consumed the building within an hour. No body was ever found. The cellar had collapsed, caving in under the weight of the charred flooring. The Wichita Eagle printed a short notice the following morning under the headline, "Saloon Fire on Main, No Casualties Reported." There was no mention of Ward, no hint of what had been found beneath. The city's new council, focused on promoting Wichita as a modern railway hub, discouraged further investigation. Still, in later editions of the History of Wichita, Kansas, the incident appears indirectly. A single line under the heading Unexplained Fires, 1889 to 1891, reads, "One notable blaze destroyed a saloon near Main and Douglas, its proprietor unaccounted for. Among the ruins, only one object survived intact, a half-melted metal plaque bearing Ward's name, and the faint outline of a top hat stamped beside it. The fire changed everything and nothing. For a week the people of Wichita spoke of little else. Smoke still clung to the street where Ward's saloon once stood, rising from the blackened earth like the ghost of its foundations. But as the embers cooled, so did the curiosity. The council made no statement, the police filed no charges, and by the end of April, it was as though the building had never existed. Constable Tolliver, however, did not let the matter rest. His private correspondence, discovered in a family trunk in 1937, reveals a man haunted by what he saw. In one letter to his brother, he wrote, "I can still smell that place when the wind shifts east. It's as if the ground remembers what we found there." Tolliver attempted to send his report to the Kansas Attorney General's office, but the packet was returned unopened. A note scrawled across the envelope read, "Local jurisdiction, not of state concern." Soon after, Tolliver resigned his post and left Wichita altogether. He would die years later in Colorado, and no obituary mentioned his service. Meanwhile, the city rebuilt quickly. A dry goods store rose where the saloon had stood. Workers laying new foundations complained of oily soil and a lingering chemical taste in the air. One foreman wrote in his journal that the dirt seeped black in the rain, like old tar. When he complained to the contractor, he was told to cover it with lime and keep quiet. By summer, the memory of Ward had faded from public talk. Only a few old-timers still mentioned his name, mostly in whispers after dark. The undertaker Laird closed his practice that same year and left for Oklahoma Territory, taking with him a sealed trunk that was said to contain his private records. That trunk would not be opened until 1958, when it was found in an abandoned carriage house and donated to the county archive. Inside were faded papers, a cracked bottle of cloudy liquid, and a note pinned to its cork that read, "From the batch below the stairs, March 1890. Chemical tests conducted decades later identified traces of ethanol, formaldehyde, and animal fat. None of it could be conclusively linked to human remains, but the composition matched descriptions in Laird's journal almost exactly. Throughout the 1890s, unconfirmed sightings of Silas Ward surfaced across Kansas and Missouri. A man matching his description, thin, pale, and always wearing a top hat, was said to have been seen running a tavern in Carthage, another in Joplin, and once even in Independence, Missouri. Each time the establishment reportedly burned within a year of opening. None of these reports were ever proven, and local papers treated them as idle gossip. but a brief mention appears in the Sedalia Democrat of May 1893. A traveler known as Mr. W. claimed to sell spirits blended by his own method. Patrons complained of a foul taste and a heaviness of the heart after drinking. He departed suddenly following the death of a customer. Though the name was abbreviated, the handwriting in the typesetter's margin copy clearly reads Ward. In later academic studies, particularly those referencing the history of Wichita, Kansas, the case became an example of the tension between civic progress and frontier secrecy, a reminder that the urge to appear respectable often buried the truth deeper than the graves themselves. Still, the story didn't end with the fire, because beneath the rebuilt storefront, a new owner would uncover something in 1895 that forced the city to confront what it had tried to forget. In September of 1895, 6 years after the fire, construction crews were digging new storage pits behind Parker Sons Dry Goods, the business that had replaced Ward's Saloon. The store had prospered, selling imported fabric and glassware to the growing middle class of Wichita. But that autumn, a spade struck something hard beneath the rear floorboards, something that wasn't stone. The workmen unearthed a small, sealed oak barrel, blackened by fire yet intact. The foreman, James Sutter, thought it might contain old spirits left over from Ward's day. When the lid was pried open, the smell that escaped drove several men back. It was described later as rancid, metallic, and strangely sweet. Inside were layers of thick, pale residue floating atop a mixture of liquid that looked like spoiled whiskey. In the center, wrapped in deteriorated burlap, was something unmistakably organic, grayish, fibrous, and shaped in part like the curve of a human arm. The city constable at that time, Robert Haynes, ordered the contents sealed and sent to the coroner in Hutchinson. His official report, filed on October 2, 1895, listed the discovery as unknown biological matter, possibly tallow or animal tissue. But in the margin of that report, still visible in the Wichita County archives, Haynes wrote in pencil, "No animal bone in barrel. Wrist joint human." Word of the finding spread quickly through the neighborhood. Parker Sons shut its doors for 2 days while the site was cleaned. The foreman and his men were instructed to dump the remaining soil into the river and say nothing. Within a week, business resumed as usual, and the discovery vanished from public notice. But something had shifted in the town's collective mood. The older residents, who still remembered the fire and the whispers about Ward, began to speak of the unfinished soul beneath Main Street. Local preacher Rev. N. Bell, by then elderly and half-blind, gave one final sermon in which he mentioned the man who brewed his sin. The congregation fell silent, and no one asked him to explain. In an 1897 letter preserved by Bell's grandson, the Reverend wrote, "There are men who distill spirits and men who distill sorrow. Only one leaves behind a stain that time cannot wash away." The Wichita Daily Eagle never printed the story of the barrel, but it did carry a brief notice 2 months later. Strong odor reported near the Parker property, source unknown. The inspector noted nothing of concern. By the turn of the century, the saloon lot had changed owners 3 more times, but the land itself seemed resistant to peace. Each successive business, first a haberdashery, then a tailor, and finally a small pharmacy, burned or closed within a few years. Locals began to call it Ward's Corner. Children dared each other to press their ears against the back wall and listen. Some claimed they could hear faint tapping from beneath the floor, like the slow drip of liquid into an empty glass. When historians compiling the history of Wichita, Kansas, revisited city records decades later, they noted how frequently that single plot appeared in fire insurance claims, 5 separate blazes between 1890 and 1912. None were ever linked to arson. The case of Silas Ward might have remained an obscure footnote in local folklore if not for one final discovery, an artifact found miles from Wichita that tied the man unmistakably to the macabre events of that winter. In 1903, a railroad inspector working outside St. Louis, Missouri, uncovered a small trunk buried near the old freight lines that once supplied liquor to Kansas towns. The trunk, rusted but intact, was stamped faintly with the initials SW and bore the label of a defunct shipping company that had operated in Wichita during the 1880s. Inside were 4 ledgers, a pewter flask, and several sealed glass vials containing a viscous amber liquid. The ledgers recorded transactions between unnamed buyers and a supplier who referred to himself only as the distiller. The earliest entry was dated 1888, and the last, March 1890, just before Ward's disappearance. The handwriting matched known samples from business licenses signed by Silas Ward. The flask was engraved with a single phrase, "To purify the soul, one must first preserve the flesh." When tested years later, the liquid in the vials contained traces of formaldehyde and rendered fat, an unusual mixture not used in any known spirit production. Authorities in St. Louis sent the find to Kansas officials, but the matter was quietly shelved. Wichita was by then a booming city of trade and industry, eager to leave behind its violent frontier image. The story of the saloon-keeper chemist didn't fit the civic narrative. Still, the discovery caught the attention of one man, Dr. Alton Reeves, a lecturer at the newly formed University of Kansas Medical College. Reeves was fascinated by preservation techniques of the 19th century and included Ward's methods in a 1907 lecture on frontier chemistry and the early practice of embalming. He described Ward's concoction as a crude but deliberate fusion of alcohol and mortuary solution, designed perhaps to experiment on both preservation and consumption. Reeves's notes, held today in the university archives, mention that several of the vials from the St. Louis trunk emitted a faint odor of whiskey layered with decay. He concluded chillingly, this man was either a misguided chemist or something much darker, a distiller of death itself. Following that lecture, local papers revived the name briefly, branding Ward a mad alchemist and Kansas ghoul. Yet, just as quickly, the fascination faded again. No grave, no body, no definitive crime had ever been proven. In the decades that followed, collectors of true crime ephemera began to seek artifacts linked to Ward. A few claimed to possess glasses, labels, even fragments of the infamous ledger. Most were fakes. But in 1921, a dusty bottle turned up in an antique shop in Jefferson City, bearing a faint mark, W, 1889. The cork was sealed with black wax. When opened, the bottle emitted a rancid sweetness so strong that the shop owner fainted. The liquid was tested by a local pharmacist, who described it as part whiskey, part something else. No further analysis was done. The bottle disappeared after a buyer from Wichita paid cash and declined to give his name. By then, Ward's whiskey had become something of a local legend. Travelers mentioned it in passing. Old-timers spoke of it with lowered voices. But the rumor that Ward had returned, older, thinner, but unmistakable, surfaced one last time in 1910, when a man in a top hat was reportedly seen standing near the ruins of the old saloon lot at dusk. Witnesses said he carried a small flask and whispered to himself, as if reciting a recipe. By 1910, Wichita had changed beyond recognition. Electric streetlights lined Douglas Avenue, trolleys clattered through downtown, and the frontier dust had been replaced with polished storefront glass. Few living citizens still remembered the fire on Main Street, or the man who once ran that ill-fated saloon. Yet the past has a peculiar way of resurfacing, especially in places that refuse to forget. On October 4, 1910, an employee at the Wichita Eagle filed a curious report. He claimed that just after sundown, while walking home, he saw a man standing motionless near the corner where Parker Sons once stood. The figure was tall and narrow, dressed in dark wool, wearing a high-crowned top hat, an antiquated style no longer seen in the city. The witness described his face as unnaturally pale, like wax in candlelight. At first, the story was dismissed as nonsense, perhaps a drunk or a vagrant. But 2 nights later, a streetcar conductor named Alfred Dent told police he'd seen a gentleman in old-fashioned dress pacing along the same stretch of road, muttering to himself. Dent swore the man carried a metal flask and stopped periodically to pour its contents onto the ground. When asked to describe the scent, Dent paused before saying, "It smelled like burnt oil or a lamp gone foul." Constable Haynes, now an older man, half retired but still respected, visited the site personally. In his final report to the City Watch, dated October 7th, he wrote, "No person found. Only residue on pavement resembling wax. The air carries the same odor I noted in '95. Impossible, but unmistakable." He closed the report with 3 words: "It is him." That same week, a small fire broke out in the basement of a hardware shop 2 doors down from the original saloon plot. The flames were contained quickly, but witnesses noted that the blaze began near the ground, as though from a spill of fuel or spirit. Investigators found no evidence of arson. Yet the old superstition revived. Residents began referring once again to the corpse whiskey lot, warning children not to linger near it after dark. Bartenders across the district swore that strange men had come asking for Ward's blend and offered cash for bottles of any age, any kind, so long as it came from Wichita. A local columnist named Eleanor Riggs wrote a reflective piece that winter titled "The Ghost in the Glass." She drew heavily from early town archives and mentioned the mysterious case briefly, comparing it to the city's buried past, described in the History of Wichita, Kansas. Her article concluded, "A city may pave over its sins, but beneath the bricks, they ferment." Her essay caused a stir, not least because the editor received an unsigned letter a week later, written in an archaic script. It contained only 1 sentence: "You cannot unmake a recipe once it has tasted blood." The letter was postmarked from Lawrence, Kansas, the same city where Dr. Alton Reeves, the lecturer who had analyzed Ward's vials, had recently died of sudden heart failure. When his laboratory was inventoried, 1 sealed bottle was found on his desk, labeled simply Sample W. The cork was intact, and the liquid inside was pale as candlelight. When Dr. Alton Reeves died in 1910, his colleagues described it as sudden but unremarkable, heart failure during late-night work. Yet the inventory taken from his university laboratory suggested something more curious. Among the usual chemicals, preserved specimens, and notebooks was a single glass bottle, corked and sealed with black wax. Its label, written in the doctor's own careful hand, read, "Sample W." The custodian who found it, Harold Bly, later testified in a university memo that the bottle gave off a heavy perfume like brandy and something faintly rotten. Reeves had reportedly been studying it for weeks, often alone after lectures. A graduate assistant recalled seeing him pour a few drops into a crystal tumbler, smell it, then mutter, he wasn't entirely wrong. No one knew who "he" referred to, but Reeves's notebooks offered a clue. 1 page, dated just 3 days before his death, contained a rough chemical analysis of the liquid. Ethanol base, suspicious organic compound, lipid origin, possibly human in derivation. Ingestion may cause paralysis of voluntary function. Source presumed Wichita, 1889. Another line, scribbled faintly in the margin, read, "Taste faintly of almonds. The burn is delayed." After Reeves's passing, the university quietly sealed the laboratory and transferred his materials to storage. The bottle was never catalogued. When the archives were reorganized in the 1940s, Sample W was no longer listed among the preserved items. Its fate remains unknown. Around the same time, reports began to circulate in Wichita once again. A retired police sergeant claimed to have seen a man in black standing near the riverbank, holding what looked like a flask. Others dismissed it as a tale meant to frighten children. But to those who remembered the old stories, the parallels were impossible to ignore. In 1911, a traveling photograph, named Ernest Malloy, visited the city, documenting what he called ghost corners of the American frontier. Among his glass plates was one labeled Wichita, the Forgotten Lot. The image shows an empty street at twilight, the blurred outline of a figure near a lamppost, and a faint white shape beside him, like smoke twisting upward from a poured drink. Historians examining Malloy's negatives years later argued the shape was likely a photographic defect. Still, the resemblance to daguerreotype spirit photography of the era was uncanny. What makes the coincidence stranger is that on the back of the same plate, Malloy scrawled a brief note. Spoke to him briefly, said his name was Silas, and that he was looking for a barrel he left behind. There is no evidence Malloy fabricated the encounter. The photograph remains one of the most discussed artifacts in Wichita's folklore archives, catalogued under Unverified Apparitions, 1900 to 1920. By then, the corpse whiskey story had slipped fully into legend, repeated in saloons, embellished in pulp magazines, and finally dismissed as superstition. Yet each generation seemed to rediscover it, usually after another unexplained fire or an odd smell rising from the earth when the rain turned the soil black. Even the editors of the History of Wichita, Kansas, added a hesitant footnote in the 1930 revision. Though unproven, the case of the vanished distiller remains one of the city's most persistent mysteries. And beneath that line, in pencil, an archivist added his own comment, later erased, but faintly visible under the paper's fibers. Maybe not vanished, maybe patient. By 1936, Wichita was no longer the rough frontier town it had been. The Great Depression had quieted its streets, the once thriving rail lines carried fewer trains, and many of the city's older records were being transferred to a newly built municipal archive. Among the clerks assigned to the task was a man named Robert Elgin, a methodical former schoolteacher with a fascination for local history. Elgin's handwritten logbook survives to this day in the Sedgwick County Historical Collection. It records, line by line, the boxes he catalogued: property deeds, early business licenses, court transcripts, and one unlabeled crate of water-damaged ledgers recovered from a condemned building on Douglas Avenue. Inside were several half-burned pages, written in the same tight, deliberate script that scholars now attribute to Silas Ward. Elgin described the find in his notes. Ink faded brown, paper brittle, but the phrasing too deliberate to mistake. Mentions mixing of fats and the still below. One entry, dated January 1890. Each batch burns hotter than the last. He turned the material over to the city archivist, who thanked him and placed the papers in temporary storage. Weeks later, Elgin returned to inquire about them, but was told no such documents were on record. When he pressed the issue, the archivist simply said, "Best not to pursue old legends." That night, Elgin wrote a long letter to a colleague at the university describing the discovery and his suspicion that someone does not wish this story retold. The letter was never mailed. It was found decades later, still folded neatly inside his notebook. Shortly after the incident, Elgin fell ill. Neighbors said he'd been complaining of a persistent metallic taste and stomach cramps. His doctor diagnosed poisoning from spoiled canned goods, but in his diary, Elgin wrote something else entirely. "I did not eat. I only handled the papers. My hands still smell of spirits." His final entry, dated March 2, 1937, reads simply, "He wrote in the margins again." No one knew what that meant, until 1952, when the basement of the old city archive flooded after a spring storm. Volunteers salvaging waterlogged boxes found one wrapped in oilcloth, its label nearly washed away. Inside were those same ledgers Elgin had described, and between the brittle pages, faint new writing appeared in the margins, written in graphite that postdated Elgin's lifetime. The added note read, "The formula remains sound." Experts who examined the handwriting couldn't determine its age conclusively, though several remarked it bore an uncanny resemblance to Ward's own. The discovery caused brief excitement among local historians before fading once more into obscurity. Still, the ledger's reappearance coincided with another curious event, a series of small fires in downtown Wichita, each starting near the ground and back alleys, never large, but each leaving behind the same residue of oily soot. Investigators blamed discarded cigarette butts. None questioned why the fires always occurred within a few blocks of Ward's original saloon site. By now, nearly 50 years after his supposed death, the name Silas Ward had become a whisper again, part ghost story, part cautionary tale for newcomers. But the documents remained, silent and patient, like a stain that no archivist could erase. In 1953, the rediscovered ledgers were transferred from the flooded archive to the University of Kansas Historical Laboratory for preservation. The papers were brittle, the ink nearly invisible under normal light. But when exposed to infrared photography, entire paragraphs reappeared. Chemical formulas, handwritten annotations, and unsettlingly clinical descriptions of rendering procedures. The curator assigned to examine them was Dr. Miriam Coles, a young chemist with a background in archival restoration. Her notes survive in the university's collection, and though most focus on the conservation process, a few passages read more like fragments from an investigation. One entry, dated May 12, 1953, reads, "Mixture described as oil of man's own making. Mentions heating at low flame for 12 hours, adding spirits in proportion 3.1. Not typical industrial method. Could indicate experimentation with adipocere or embalming fluid." Adipocere, the waxy substance formed from decomposing human fat, was known in forensic circles, but few outside of pathology used the term. The specificity disturbed Coles. She consulted a retired professor of chemistry who remarked that such knowledge would not have been common for a saloon keeper unless he had training in mortuary practices. On another page of Ward's ledger, she found the words, "The living oil burns cleaner than tallow. 1 glass to the lips, and they sleep like marble." Coles later wrote, "The phrasing is deliberate, not poetic, a record, not a confession." In her correspondence with the Wichita Historical Society, Coles requested additional materials from the original site. The reply she received contained only a brief note. No samples preserved. Location redeveloped in 1949. Site now part of a parking structure. Still, she persisted. Using early spectrographic methods, she analyzed residue from one surviving paying. The results suggested trace compounds of formalin, ethyl alcohol, and oleic acid, a mixture consistent with both alcohol distillation and primitive embalming fluids of the 1880s. Her report concluded cautiously, "If authentic, this document bridges the practices of mortuary chemistry and alcohol refinement. The intention appears to be consumption, not preservation." The paper caused a stir among faculty, but was never formally published. Soon afterward, Coles withdrew from the university, citing health concerns. In a private letter written to her sister, she mentioned recurring nightmares of a man behind a counter stirring a glass that will not cool. Her resignation left the ledgers unstudied for nearly 2 decades. When a new team of researchers reopened them in 1971, several pages were missing, including those describing the recipe. The last recorded custodian to sign the ledger checkout sheet was a visiting historian from Missouri named Harlan Vick, who claimed to be researching the frontier distilleries of the Great Plains. Vick returned to St. Louis later that year, but never published his findings. When his widow donated his personal effects to a regional museum in 1985, among them was a half-filled glass bottle labeled simply S. Ward, 1889. Tests on the liquid found high ethanol content, faint traces of fatty acids, and a preservative compound nearly identical to the one Dr. Coles had identified decades earlier. The museum sealed the bottle and placed it in restricted storage. By then, even the scholars who once pursued the story spoke of it with caution. The phrase, corpse whiskey, had moved from archive notes into folklore once again. Yet the evidence persisted, physical and silent. By the spring of 1974, the bottle labeled S. Ward 1889 had become a source of quiet fascination within the museum's restricted collection. It sat sealed inside a temperature-controlled cabinet, unremarkable among jars of pickled reptiles and century-old tonics. Yet the curatorial log shows that one researcher repeatedly requested access, Dr. Harlan Vick, the visiting historian from Missouri. Vick's field notebooks, later recovered by his estate, reveal that his interest went far beyond local distillery records. In a penciled margin beside one entry, he wrote, "He understood decomposition as a process to refine, not destroy, a perverse inversion of purity." He compared Ward's methods to early chemical preservation experiments used by undertakers in the post-Civil War Midwest, precisely the same period documented in the history of Wichita, Kansas. Vick theorized that Ward had apprenticed under a mortician or chemist, acquiring enough knowledge to blend alcohol with human lipid compounds to create a hybrid preservative drink. On June 11, 1974, museum staff noted that Dr. Vick signed out the bottle for microscopic analysis. He worked alone in a closed laboratory for several hours. When the night custodian entered at 2 a.m., the lights were still on, but the door was locked from inside. By morning, the curator found Vick collapsed beside the workstation. The autopsy cited acute respiratory failure. The bottle was gone. Authorities assumed it had shattered or been misplaced during cleanup, yet no fragments were recovered. The stainless steel surface of the lab table, however, bore a thin, iridescent film that resisted all cleaning agents. A technician described the smell as sweet, like whiskey mixed with ether. Vick's assistant, Laura Briggs, later recalled that her mentor had been unsettled in the days before his death. He told her he'd deciphered the final section of Ward's ledger, a short Latin inscription scrawled beneath the chemical proportions. The phrase translated roughly as, "What is rendered once may live twice." In the official report, Briggs admitted she'd seen him uncork the bottle briefly, sniff the contents, then whisper, "He was right about the smoothness." The museum quietly closed the case. Publicly, Vick's death was attributed to accidental fume inhalation. Internally, the staff agreed never to display the remaining Ward materials. They were boxed, sealed, and transferred to deep storage. 2 years later, the night guard who supervised that wing resigned after claiming to hear footsteps in the locked archive corridor and the distinct sound of glass clinking, like someone pouring a drink and toasting in the dark. His statement, dismissed at the time, is preserved in the institution's security log. Afterward, rumors circulated among Wichita's historians that the missing bottle had not been lost at all, that it was quietly returned to Kansas by unknown hands. A local collector reported receiving an unmarked parcel in 1977, wrapped in waxed cloth and smelling faintly of brandy. Inside was an antique flask engraved with the initials SWW and a card that read, "By 1980, American television had entered what critics called the Age of Rediscovery, a wave of documentaries revisiting forgotten crimes, mysteries, and regional legends. Among them was a small production by Frontier Lens, a Kansas-based historical program that aired late at night on public broadcasting. One of their episodes, titled The Distiller of Death, a Wichita Legend, sought to separate truth from myth in the story of Silas Ward. The episode's researcher, Helen Carver, was known for her meticulous archival work. She requested access to municipal and university files, including the sealed Ward materials last handled after Dr. Harlan Vick's death. For reasons never fully explained, her request was approved. The Frontier Lens team filmed over 3 days inside the university's restricted collection wing. Carver's production notes, now part of the station's surviving archives, mentioned the unsettling atmosphere. "We were told not to touch anything, yet the smell, chemical, faintly sweet, was impossible to ignore. It lingered even after we left the room." The program aired on November 3, 1980, blending interviews with historians, dramatized reenactments, and shots of the charred building foundations where Ward's saloon once stood. Viewers were struck by the restraint of the narration, which avoided sensationalism, but what drew attention most was the closing minute, a brief clip that wasn't in the shooting script. In it, the camera panned across a glass display case. For a fraction of a second, a dark bottle sealed in wax appeared reflected in the glass. The reflection seemed to move slightly, as though someone just beyond frame were lifting it. The segment ended abruptly, cutting to credits. Within days, the production office began receiving anonymous phone calls. One voice, described by Carver as low and deliberate, repeated the same phrase each time. "The recipe is not yours to tell." The tape was reviewed by technicians, but no trace of tampering or double exposure could be found. Nevertheless, the station pulled the episode from future broadcasts. A single copy was archived for internal use only. In 1984, the studio experienced a small electrical fire that destroyed several shelves of film reels, including the Ward episode. The backup tape stored off-site was reportedly missing when archivists attempted to recover it in the 1990s. Carver herself withdrew from television work soon after, turning to teaching and local history lectures. In an interview given years later, she described her experience with unshakable calm. It wasn't a haunting, it was continuity. Some stories don't stop when people do. They distill themselves until they're pure enough to survive. Following the broadcast, renewed interest in Ward's legend brought researchers, collectors, and even amateur ghost hunters to Wichita. They photographed the lot where the saloon once stood, by then a cracked stretch of pavement behind a warehouse, and claimed the soil still carried a faint odor, especially after rain. City engineers blamed residue from an old drainage line. Locals weren't convinced. That winter, a small fire broke out in the warehouse's basement. Investigators called it an electrical short. The owner told a newspaper reporter that he'd smelled something like lamp oil just before it started. When asked later if the fire began near the same patch of earth where the saloon once stood, he answered quietly. The 1984 warehouse fire was minor by city standards. No injuries, limited damage. But what investigators found afterward reopened questions long considered folklore. During cleanup, workers unearthed an old tin box buried in the subfloor near the fire's origin point. The lid was rusted, the hinges fused, and when pried open, it revealed a stack of photographs wrapped in brittle newspaper. Among them was a daguerreotype-style portrait depicting a man in formal attire behind what appeared to be a saloon counter. The subject's expression was stiff and unsmiling, his eyes sharp and hollow, and a faint scar marked the side of his cheek. Across the bottom edge, a hand-etched inscription read, S. Ward, Wichita, 1889. The image was verified as authentic by experts from the Kansas Historical Society. The style of plate and exposure time matched the late 1880s exactly. What unsettled examiners wasn't the photograph's age, but the glass bottle visible in the frame's corner, a small, unmarked flask sealed with black wax. When magnified, it reflected a shape that looked disturbingly like a human face, distorted in the liquid's sheen. The discovery drew brief attention from local newspapers before vanishing from headlines. The official report listed the image as artifact of indeterminate historical value. Yet internal correspondence between fire inspectors tells a different story. In a memo dated December 18, 1984, investigator Harold Madsen wrote, I can't explain the burn pattern. The fire spread outward in a perfect circle from that spot. No accelerant, no ignition source. It's as if the floor ignited itself. The photo was stored at the Wichita Historical Museum for analysis, but within a month, staff began reporting unusual corrosion on nearby metal fixtures, tiny dark rings appearing as though etched by acid. The curator ordered the image sealed in a climate-controlled case. In 1986, a graduate photography student named Linda Reyes requested permission to examine it for a thesis on 19th-century portraiture. She took a single exposure under filtered light. When developed, her negative showed a faint additional figure standing behind Ward's shoulder, a man in an apron, head bowed, his hands blurred as if moving. Reyes insisted she had not manipulated the image. The museum dismissed it as a double exposure, yet subsequent attempts to reproduce the anomaly failed. She abandoned her thesis soon after, later telling a colleague she'd been plagued by a recurring dream of a saloon basement and jars filled with yellow glass. Years later, the museum's insurance archive recorded a curious note. Artifact number C, 1889 requires controlled humidity due to persistent odor. Staff described it as metallic, oily, faintly sweet, the same language found in Constable Tolliver's 1890 report. The reappearance of the photograph renewed quiet discussion among historians. Some argued that the image finally proved Ward's existence beyond rumor, while others called it a hoax too elaborate for its time. A few whispered that the man in the background might be Henry Pike, the drifter whose death had first brought attention to the saloon nearly a century before. Yet no matter how many times the image was studied, one detail resisted explanation: the faint discoloration along the photo's lower edge. Under ultraviolet light, it shimmered a dull copper red, forming what appeared to be a thin, uneven ring, like the stain left by the bottom of a drinking glass. By the late 1990s, forensic technology had advanced enough that the Wichita Historical Museum decided to re-examine several of its unsolved artifacts, including the daguerreotype marked S. Ward, Wichita, 1889. The initiative was part of a state-funded effort to digitize and chemically test deteriorating photographic plates. The project's lead researcher, Dr. Nathan Bellamy, specialized in trace material analysis. He requested permission to swab the edges of the glass plate for organic residue. The museum agreed, expecting nothing unusual, but when the results returned from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation's lab, the findings were quietly withheld from public release. According to an internal memo later leaked to a local journalist, the sample contained microscopic traces of human adipose material, degraded fat cells consistent with those found in preserved tissue, not fingerprints. The laboratory noted that such residue could not have formed naturally on a photographic plate, unless it had been contaminated by contact with biological matter before sealing. In simpler terms, someone's remains, minute though they were, had fused into the image itself. Dr. Bellamy, cautious but intrigued, expanded his research. He tracked down chemical supply records from 19th century Wichita and discovered that one distributor, R. Halbrook Co., had shipped multiple barrels of distilled spirits and carbolic acid to a buyer listed only as SW in 1888. The address on the invoice matched the corner where Ward's saloon once stood. When Bellamy published a brief paper on early contaminants in daguerreotype media, he omitted the name Ward entirely. Yet, in a private letter to a colleague, he admitted, "The levels of protein degradation suggest direct exposure to liquefied organic material, perhaps from the same source as the mixture itself. If the legend of the whiskey made from human fat was ever based in truth, this is the first physical evidence." Soon after, Bellamy reported a series of strange incidents. His laboratory temperature controls malfunctioned repeatedly, and a faint sweet odor began to permeate the room where the image was kept. Staff joked that the ghost of the bartender had returned, but Bellamy wasn't amused. In an interview recorded years later, his assistant recalled that he began to experience vivid dreams, visions of a man in a dark waistcoat, face obscured, stirring liquid in a copper vat while humming under his breath. Bellamy dismissed them as the result of overwork. On March 11, 1999, the lab's fire alarm triggered at 2:47 a.m. Security cameras showed no intruder, but one feed captured a brief flicker of light near the display cabinet, a burst like a gas flare, followed by darkness. When staff arrived, the air was heavy with the scent of burnt alcohol. The photograph remained intact, but its glass surface had clouded over, as if fogged from within. Bellamy resigned within the month. He left Kansas altogether, moving east and refusing interviews. Before his departure, he sent a short letter to the museum director containing only this line: "Some formulas are written to be remembered, not repeated." The photograph has never been publicly displayed since. In 2002, the museum released a digital replica for academic use. Curiously, in the scanned version, the faint ring along the lower edge had changed color, from copper to a pale gray, like ash. Some claim that when viewed under certain light, a second reflection appears faintly beside Ward's image. A man in uniform, hat in hand, standing as though mid-toast. It matches the surviving portrait of Constable Tolliver almost exactly. By the early 2000s, the legend of Silas Ward had found new life, not through official history, but through message boards, amateur documentaries, and the strange persistence of urban folklore. True crime enthusiasts shared scans of the daguerreotype, debating whether it showed a real 19th century bartender or a staged fraud. Paranormal forums filled with stories from locals claiming the area near Douglas and Maine still carried the scent of burnt sugar and whiskey on humid nights. A short-lived website titled corpsewhiskey.com appeared in 2006, run by a Wichita College student named Evan Hurst. The site compiled every public record, rumor, and photo connected to Ward. It gained attention when Hurst uploaded an audio clip recorded near the old saloon lot, a low humming sound followed by what seemed like the clink of glass. The recording spread quickly online. Within a week, Hurst removed the clip, posting only a short message. "The hum isn't on the tape anymore. It's in my house." Neighbors later reported the smell of smoke coming from his apartment, though no fire was found. Hurst moved away shortly after and deleted all his accounts. Local journalists tried to revive public interest in the story. One feature in the Wichita Beacon revisited early sources like Constable Tolliver's 1890 notes and the footnotes from the history of Wichita, Kansas. The reporter, Mara Tilley, wrote that revisiting those archives felt like touching something still warm. She also uncovered a curious record from 1912, a property transfer for the original saloon lot. The new owner had been listed under an alias, Simon Ward, who signed the deed with a flourish and a distinctive top hat symbol beside his name. The clerk's handwriting notes beside it read, "Claimed to be nephew, though no birth record exists." Tilley's article concluded with an unsettling parallel. The license expired in 1914, the same year the ground beneath the new structure caved in after heavy rain. Workers reported finding shards of glass and bone mixed in the soil. None of it was preserved. Her piece revived interest briefly, but also sparked vandalism at the site. Graffiti appeared on the walls reading "The Recipe Lives" and "To the Barrel Below." The city painted them over, yet within days they returned, always in the same hand, always traced in what appeared to be rust-colored paint. In 2010, the centennial of the last verified sighting of Ward, a small group of local historians held a nighttime walking tour called the Corpse Whiskey Trail. Participants reported that the moment they reached the corner, once occupied by the saloon, the air grew noticeably colder. Several people described an odd flickering near the pavement, like the glint of a bottle under a lantern. Police later dispersed onlookers when smoke began seeping from a storm drain nearby. It dissipated quickly, leaving no source. One officer remarked afterward that the smell was half whiskey, half something else I'd rather not name. Since then, the story of Silas Ward has endured quietly, not as a tale of ghosts, but of memory, an unfinished ledger in the city's history that no council resolution can quite erase. Every decade or so, a new investigator or filmmaker returns to the trail, certain they'll find a logical end to the story. None ever have. And when they dig through archives or visit that corner where the soil still refuses to stay dry, they often remark on the same peculiar feeling, an awareness that someone unseen is standing just over their shoulder, humming softly, as though stirring a drink. Today, the lot where Ward's Temperance Saloon once stood is nothing remarkable. It's a narrow strip of cracked asphalt behind a row of offices near Douglas and Main, wedged between a laundromat and a vacant print shop. Most people walk past without noticing the faint depression in the ground or the thin line of discolored soil that refuses to match the rest. But locals still talk. A night guard at a nearby parking garage claims that some evenings, usually when the wind comes off the river, he can smell whiskey and something faintly chemical, like burnt oil mixed with sugar. Another worker swears that when the rain pools near the back wall, the water turns darker, as if rising from below. The Wichita Historical Museum, which still holds the daguerreotype and fragments of Ward's ledgers, keeps them sealed in a climate-controlled room. Visitors occasionally ask to see them, but access is restricted. The curator describes the decision as precautionary, though in a 2017 interview he admitted the staff often hear faint knocking inside the case, like glass tapping glass. City records from the early 2000s list no official memorial to the event, though the history of Wichita, Kansas still maintains its modest footnote. Unverified accounts suggest a saloon keeper disappeared following reports of tainted whiskey, 1889. No remains found. Yet the story survives, not in textbooks or lectures, but in the half-remembered details passed quietly from one local to another. A century after the fire, the words still linger in old letters, court files, and whispered warnings to newcomers. Don't drink what you can't trace, and never trust a man who stirs his glass too long. The most recent account comes from a delivery driver in 2022 who claimed that while dropping off supplies to a nearby office, he saw a man standing at the corner in outdated dress, dark waistcoat, chain watch, top hat tilted low. When the driver looked away and back again, the figure was gone, though a small puddle of amber liquid remained where he had stood. Police dismissed the sighting. The pavement was dry by morning. Still, the story endures. Historians and skeptics alike agree that no verifiable record of Ward's death exists. No grave, no obituary, no definitive proof. Only the same recurring trace. The smell, the stains, the strange quiet that seems to fall over that corner long after dusk. And if you stand there on a still night, when the wind from the south carries a faint warmth through downtown Wichita, some say you can almost hear it. A low hum, rhythmic and deliberate, like a man stirring something thick in a glass. The sound fades quickly, leaving only the distant clatter of traffic and the uneasy feeling that the ground beneath you is remembering. Because some stories never truly end. They just keep distilling themselves until history tastes them again.